That's women's Bible study.
Oh,
You can go join that.
yeah. I don't identify that way.
No, seriously, they don't exclude anybody. I made a joke one time about staying, and they were all like, sit.
All right, so tonight is our last of our biblical literacy classes, and we're talking about the book of Revelation. And again, this is not meant to be an exposition of the book, but to lay out some of the important biblical and theological issues that are addressed in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation obviously is unique in the New Testament. It's our only prophecy book. And it really follows in many ways the apocalyptic literature of the Old Testament prophets, particularly Daniel and Ezekiel, as well as Zechariah. Now that doesn't mean that none of the other prophets talk about the end of the world or the millennial kingdom. It just means that the language that is used by Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah, particularly in chapters 6 through 19 in the book of Revelation, are very similar in terms of their symbolic use. So, the promise of the book of Revelation comes at the end. And behold, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy in this book. One of the things that has been the important teaching of the church from the apostolic times, really since the ascension of Christ, has been his imminent return. And by that we mean his any moment return. There's nothing right now that prevents Christ from coming back. And so his imminent return is a very important part of the book of Revelation, because the things that are laid out and taught in the book of Revelation are things that will happen starting in chapter 4 after the rapture of the church. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along here. Now the author, and I don't ever want to present this in a way that makes you think there isn't any debate. There is debate, okay? But since I know what is correct, I will tell you what my opinion is. The writer of the book of Revelation is John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12. Now, what's very interesting about John is that when he is recording, and that's pretty much what he's doing here, he is recording what God tells him to record. Unlike his gospel, unlike the epistles of John, this is more of a dictation kind of thing. God is showing him things, he's writing them down. But John is probably in his 90s. John is the only one of the 12 who did not die a martyr. But John went through a lot of persecution in his life. Probably one of the more infamous stories is the situation in which he was actually boiled in oil and was not injured. A miraculous event attributed to John's apostleship. So John was writing at a time when he had a long view back. But you have to remember that this was probably 60 years after Christ's earthly ministry that he's writing these things. So there is some significance to that in my view. I just mentioned the date. It's probably in the mid-90s. A lot of people try to date the book of Revelation based on whether or not Jerusalem had already been destroyed, and that happened in 70 AD. And we'll talk about the different interpretation approaches. But most conservative authors would date it somewhere, the writing in somewhere in the mid-90s. What's interesting is when you study John's Gospel, John also wrote his Gospel very late. So John's Gospel not only doesn't follow the same pattern as the synoptics like we talked about last time, but his Gospel was written much later. Okay. The genre. I was going to put a subtitle, Apocalypse Now, but anyway. So one of the things that I think sometimes we don't realize as Christians is that there were a number of apocalyptic authors back in the first century. Actually, in the first century BC as well. One of the reasons for that was that, and these were Jewish folks, okay? One of the reasons that there was so much apocalyptic literature, that is, the idea that God was going to come judge the world and there was going to be an end to it all, okay? One of the reasons that was so popular is because the Jewish people at that time were relatively well versed in the prophets and what the prophets foretold. So they knew, and from their history, they knew that God was not going to stand for the occupation of the land by people other than the Jews themselves. So a lot of people, when they think about at least chapters 4 to 19, and even the Great White Throne Judgment, think about it in terms of the end of the world or apocalyptic literature. But what's interesting is if you look at apocalyptic literature, much of it was written and not a lot of it was preached. Okay? So there were a lot of apocalyptic authors, people that wrote about the end, but they didn't necessarily present their material at the synagogue. Okay? Because again, that would be outside the realm of what would be expected by the rabbis. So there are two things that are included in apocalyptic literature, and usually when these two things are present, it's what people then will attribute the writing to be apocalyptic. One is that there is a group, a holy group or a group of righteous people who await God's deliverance. And of course, for the Jewish writers, that was the Jews. Okay? They were the people who were holy and right, and they were waiting for God's deliverance. And their persecutors were destined for wrath and were beyond the reach of redemption. Okay? So, when we think about redemption, is it ever too late for anybody?
Yes. Once you're dead.
When you die, it's too late, right? There's also something called the sin unto death. And I interpret that to mean, and good people disagree with me, but they don't know what they're talking about. You can come to a point where you have said no enough to God, where He's done with you. And that's called the sin unto death. And some of you know that I wrote an article on evil for the last newsletter. I got a subsequent article coming up in the next newsletter that will continue that series. But there is a dark side to humanity that, because historically Western culture has been Christianized, okay, is often not observed, but we're starting to see it more and more. The farther we get away from Christian truth as a culture and as a nation, the farther the West moves away from the concept of a holy and righteous God, the more likely it is that there are going to be more and more people who are evil. And the general argument is that most of the time we talk about evil behavior, right? We don't say evil people. We talk about evil behavior. But I believe the scripture really teaches that there are evil people, okay, that have to... So anyway, there are people who are beyond the reach of redemption. There is, and somebody mentioned it, there's death, okay? But the book of Revelation also talks about what's called the second death. Do you know what the second death is? Cast into hell. Okay? Once that event takes place, that's it. There's no more opportunity for redemption. So most apocalyptic literature has some beyond redemption people that are against the righteous ones. Okay? And that's kind of, yeah, John?
I've got one question you mentioned about that up to the time of death. Okay, and I've dealt with this not only because of the thief who was on the cross.
Yeah.
And asked, Lord, he said, you'll be with me in paradise. So my thing is, okay, I lived 80 years of my life. Every day I broke every rule in the Bible and everything that could possibly happen, and I did it. And then 3 minutes before I'm going to figure out that I'm going to die, I asked, please forgive me, God, for all my sins. And I'm forgiven.
Okay.
So I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
Do you have a question there, John?
Yeah, but so can that happen then, or is it?
Well, if you look at Harmar theology, which is the doctrine of sin, okay, if I gave you a small bucket of manure, and then I gave you a great big bucket of manure, would they both smell?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the nature of sin. It's not the amount, okay? It is the structure of sin. Sin stinks, so to speak, okay? So the amount of sin is irregardless still sin. So, yeah, people can accept the Lord the last breath, okay? Even if they have lived a life, that is not pleasing to Him. Now, let me add a caveat, okay? If you live 80 years and you heard the gospel before, you're probably not going to be converted at your last breath. Okay? Because there's a process called the hardening of the heart. Okay? So, the thief on the cross, per se, didn't know of the ministry of Jesus. All he saw was the man on the cross and what he said and people said he was. And based on that cross testimony, he was converted. So it wasn't like the thief had spent his life in rebellion towards God or, having known the gospel and rejected it. But rather, it was that moment in time, at the end of his life, when he was first exposed to the gospel. And that's what made the difference. All right. Okay, so,
Hey, John, can I just ask a question on that sin unto death? So, do you hold the position that the sin unto death can occur for both the believer and, of course, the unbeliever? That the believer, God can be like, you're in spiritual rebellion, and God's just kind of like done to you. When Ecclesiastes 12 kind of speak to that, I think that kind of is targeted, obviously, is written for believers, right? And
well, I don't believe that a believer can ever lose their salvation.
no, I'm not talking about salvation,
Yeah.
a separate issue. I'm talking about the sin unto death, where if you're in rebellion,
If you live in rebellion, yeah.
that where maybe God just kind of like,
Right,
hey,
Paul said, there were two guys that Paul said, I'm delivering them over to Satan for the salvation of their souls because of their evil deeds. Okay? So there is, for a Christian, yeah, that sense that at some point God's going to be done with you behaving the way you do. Okay? My position is, however, a born-again Christian cannot long live in sin without questioning whether they really know the Lord. That to me, that's the bigger issue. If you can just go and live in a wicked way, kind of believing that I punched my ticket to heaven because I accepted Jesus, I'm not sure you have. And some people call that lordship salvation, but that's kind of how I see it. But as I often say, I could be wrong.
yeah, Paul Washer talks in Shocking Message. You don't meet Jesus and not be changed.
Right.
It's like you don't step in front of a semi-truck and not get changed.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thank you for your comments. But the big idea, yeah, John, go ahead.
No, I'm not, I'm just giggling to myself, I don't know why. Don't ask me,
Who gave John whiskey before this started?
nobody.
Just kidding, John. Love you, brother. Okay, the big idea of the book of Revelation. The big idea of the book of Revelation is not to give us all kinds of information about terrible things that are going to happen. That's not the purpose. The purpose or the message of the book of Revelation is to give us hope and encouragement when we face persecution. That in the end, who wins? Christ. In the end, Christ wins. And so the hope is the promise of the new creation. So the book of Revelation is a message of hope and encouragement for those Christians who are enduring persecution, with the fine and important assurance that the ultimate victory will be Christ, and that the promise of a new heaven and a new earth is ours to have. All right, so the storyline, you almost have to understand Paul's words at the church at Ephesus when he said, put on the whole armor of God. Why did he say that? Because we wrestle not against principalities and powers, but against evil forces. Okay? And what the book of Revelation gives us as part of the storyline is that there is a cosmic conflict going on that we don't even see. Okay? That there is a battle raging for control of God's creation. And that battle is being waged by the forces of evil, the devil and his minions, against the forces of God. And in this particular dispensation, that is the church. But, as we all have just celebrated, there is a clear sense in which that war that cosmic war is over. Jesus, tetelestai, it is finished. So the war is actually won. And what now is going on is this futile attempt by the forces of evil to change the storyline. What Revelation does for us is it reminds us that that storyline is valid. Y'all following me here? That no matter what Satan does, no matter what the forces of evil do, they lost. The buzzer's already rung. They can shoot baskets all day, but the game's over. But they just keep shooting baskets. Because the ultimate and final victory, as presented to us in the book of Revelation, has not happened yet. All right. Okay. Let's see. This is another slide on the storyline. And again, it's the same reality. That is, who's behind the church's trials and temptations? The forces of evil. So it is not that they are impotent. That's why we are to put on the whole armor of God. Is because they're still messing with us. They're still messing with the people of God. So I hope that what you're taking away from this is that the history of the church, both historically, presently, and until Jesus comes, is a history of suffering. Now you and I may be fat and happy, okay? You and I may not be afraid somebody's going to come to our home tonight, or somebody's going to come through that door and arrest us, or take away a family member, okay? We don't live in that kind of environment in the United States, at least not tonight. But the story of the church is suffering. The story of the church is persecution. That the redemptive process that God set in motion in the Garden of Eden when he said that the woman's seed would bruise the head of the serpent. That story of redemption is ongoing. Remember last time I talked about already but not yet? Okay? That's an important concept to keep in mind. Okay, so what you have in chapters 2 and 3 are the 7 churches of Asia Minor. Now there's a lot of different ways in which people have interpreted chapters 2 and 3 in the 7 churches. Some people, like me, believe that they were literal churches at that time that Christ instructed John to write to. Okay? Some people believe they just symbolize the history of the church. And so, for some people, it has more to do with the kinds of problems that the church gets into over the course of time versus being literal churches. Okay? Some people actually believe, and I'm not trying to be a wise guy. I mean, I think they're wrong, but doesn't mean they're not smart, and maybe they are right. Look at it as actually distinct periods of church history, so that when you begin looking at the churches, they each represent a identified chronology in the history of the church. So, the church at Laodicea, for example, the last church that John writes about would actually be representative, if we are in the last church age, would be representative of the church today. Okay? Does that make any sense? But my own personal opinion is these were literally 7 churches, and they had different problems, but they all had problems. And as a result of that, they do, in a very powerful way, teach us what we have to look out for as local churches that could derail us from doing God's work in God's way. All right.
Hey Don, on that church thing, there is one other teaching, R.B. Theme out of Dallas Theological Seminary. He held the view that the churches were literal, the 7 churches, God works in number 7, and then John, after that, the church in Ephesus, the church. And then he says, after this I looked up, so that the church age, that signified the end of the church age, and then coming into, the end times and the return of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was his teaching, and
Yeah. And I'm not saying those are invalid. I'm just saying they're wrong. That. But I don't think you can. I don't actually think you can make that inference. But I realize that people a lot smarter than me do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some theologians will do that and against it.
Yeah. Okay. So Jesus' message to John. Jesus sent his revelation to John to fortify his churches. And there are 3 main characters in the book of Revelation during the tribulation period. One is the beast, one is the false prophet, and the other is referred to as the harlot or the prostitute. And they represent the kinds of problems that are typical for the church: intimidating violence, deceptive heresy, and beguiling affluence. So the message that Jesus dictated or gave to John symbolically is represented by these particular characters in the book of Revelation. All right. Okay, so the big point out of this particular slide is that John, at this time, had been exiled from Ephesus, was on the Isle of Patmos, and it was there that he recorded his visions. Probably put there in exile by the Roman emperor. John spent most of his ministry after his time in Palestine in Asia Minor, particularly at Ephesus. Okay? In fact, if you go to Ephesus today, you'll find a place where they say John the Baptist is buried. Okay? That was a long area of ministry. And do you remember why John went to Ephesus? At the cross. What happened at the cross when Jesus looked at Mary, his mother? What did he say to his disciples? Here's your mother. John took that literally, and actually church history would suggest that John actually took Mary to Ephesus and cared for her there. Okay. So here's a map of Asia Minor. Obviously, these are not the only churches in Asia Minor, okay? Obviously, there were other churches besides the 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation. And you can see where the Isle of Patmos there is off of the coast of Asia Minor. But in a sense, this is the geographical area. And one of the things about this area, do you know what the modern day country is? Turkey. And Turkey houses one of the fewest number of Christians, professing Christians in all the world. Okay? So, kind of the cradle of the early New Testament church has been eviscerated in terms of what the government and most people look at the conquering of that area of the world by the Ottoman Turks as being the reason that happened. All right. Key themes of the book of Revelation: the fall of Babylon. Babylon symbolizes everything evil. The return of Christ, his ultimate victory over evil, establishment of the new heaven and new earth. God's sovereignty. God is in ultimate control over everything, even the forces of evil. That in the end, God wins. And as I mentioned earlier, hope and encouragement. It's meant to be a source of comfort and encouragement to believers, especially in times of persecution and hardship. All right. So basically, if you want to divide the book up, you have a prologue, a body, and an epilogue. The prologue and epilogue reflect the same ideas. Blessings on those who keep the prophecy, John's identification of himself, designation of God as Alpha and Omega. So the prologue and epilogue are very similar from that perspective. The book's main body, as I mentioned earlier, chapters 2 and 3, things that are, if you look at, thought I had it here somewhere. If you look at Revelation 1:19, Revelation is a book about the things that are and the things that will be. And the things that will be start in chapter 4. All right. Are you bored yet? Yeah, my wife is shaking her head, yes. Oh. All right. So, there are four main interpretations that theologians have used for the book of Revelation. The futurist interpretation is what I've been suggesting to you to this point. That is, the things that are listed there in chapter 4 to the end of the book are things that are yet future events. The historical interpretation basically sees the book as an overview of church history. The preterist position basically says that everything that's in the book of Revelation has already happened. And the idealist interpretation is that everything in the book is symbolic and not literal, and what we glean from it is the struggle between good and evil. So obviously I take the futurist position, and most conservative scholars do. All right, so where does all this come from? Where does all the issues in the book of Revelation really come from? They come from a concept called the Day of the Lord in the Old Testament, okay? And the Day of the Lord is a time of both blessing and judgment, as it's described by the Old Testament prophets. And so when we look at it today, in light of the book of Revelation, it really comes in three parts, and they come consecutively. The first part is the day of God's judgment, which is the tribulation period. The second part is the day of God's promise to Israel, which is the millennium. And the third part is the day of God's new creation, the new heaven and the new earth. And so the day of the Lord, when you read about it in the Old Testament prophets, can hit on any one of these three particular aspects of the day of the Lord. You have to get the New Testament to have a clearer understanding. All right, sorry, I should have put that up there. Everybody see that? It's kind of a pretty graph. Anyway, all right. So we talk about the first part of the day of the Lord, talk about tribulationalism. There's basically three views for people that hold to a tribulational reality or something that really is going to happen, which would basically be the futurist interpretation. One is something called pre-tribulationalism, which is the correct view. I'm just going to tell you like it is. I was figuring it out today. I have preached through this entire book 7 times in the course of my life. And so I kind of know it pretty well. And I'm right. Yeah. I knew you were going to call me out, Scott.
You do realize this is being recorded, right?
Yeah, you probably throw me. Anyway, so.
He's going to wake up and the first thing he's going to say is, what's Don saying now?
Yeah. Okay, so pre-tribulationalism has, and I'm going to talk about it more in detail in just a second, but it's the idea that the tribulation happens before the millennium, okay? But more importantly, it happens at the beginning of the tribulation. And the event at the beginning of the tribulation, from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, is the rapture of the church. Mid-tribulationism, or what's called, Jeff likes to call it the pre-wrath rapture. Basically, the book of Revelation does lay out the fact that the 7-year period comes from the book of Daniel, okay? And the first 3.5 years are a time of what Revelation says of peace and safety. And from 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul says there's going to be a man of lawlessness. We refer to him as the Antichrist, who's going to come along and offer the world tariffs. No, just kidding. Yeah, to get your shorts in a knot. Anyway, I just had to do that. If he's not Hitler, I guess he's the Antichrist, right? Anyway. No, I don't believe that. All right. So, in Paul's description, and this is where, Jeff and I kind of disagree. I shouldn't say that. He's not here to defend himself. He might say, no, I agree with you that. And we've never really talked at length about this, but the idea is that the Antichrist is going to be a good guy in the beginning for the first 3.5 years. And then the midpoint of the tribulation, there is going to be a desecration of the temple in Jerusalem that the Antichrist facilitated the rebuilding of. And this happened back in the early part of the 1st century with the Antiphonus Epiphanes or something like that, who sacrificed a pig on the altar. But the idea is that the first 3.5 years are a time of peace and everybody gets along and it's all good. And then all of a sudden, bad things start happening and goes from bad to worse. Okay? So there is a clear distinction between the first 3.5 years of the tribulation and the second 3.5 years. There are a series of judgments called the seals, the bowls, and the trumpets that take place primarily in that last 3.5 years. So the argument goes that the rapture occurs in the middle of the tribulation once the Antichrist changes his mind, so to speak. Then there's post-tribulationalism, and post-tribulationalism really has its cogent argument, the fact that how many times does Christ have to come back? Okay? So in a pre-tribulational argument, you have the rapture, that would be the return of Christ. And at the end, you have what's often referred to as the second coming, where Christ comes to earth with his legions and defeats the devil in the Battle of Armageddon. Okay? So a lot of people that embrace post-tribulationalism believe that the church is going to go through a time of severe judgment and persecution, and at the end of that, before the millennium, Christ is going to come back. So the rapture and the second coming are basically at the same time. Okay? That makes sense? All right. What haven't I said that I need to say here? Print's too small, Stephen. So the idea with mid-tribulationalism is that, and this is the argument that most make, if you go by Matthew 24, it doesn't seem that the church is part of the tribulation, okay? And the tribulation spoken of there is the persecution part. So there is the Olivet Discourse in Mark 13 that you have to take into consideration. And so as a result, the pre-wrath rapture makes a good scriptural point, okay? That it may be that we will be here for the first 3.5, and it won't be until God's wrath is spilled out in the second 3.5 years that we will escape that wrath. Okay, in post-tribulationalism again, the church goes through the tribulation. All the saints are resurrected at the end of the tribulation prior to the millennium. And most people that hold a post-tribulational view are people that embrace covenant theology, and a lot of times they have what's called an amillennial position on the kingdom itself. So a pre-tribulationalist like myself makes a distinction between Israel and the church. Okay? The church and Israel are two different things. God promised Israel a millennium. He didn't promise the church a millennium. He promised Israel a millennium. And so the millennium is really about God's fulfilling his promise, which started with Abraham. Remember? God promised that all the nations of the earth would be blessed, that he would establish his kingdom, that he would give them a land, etc. Okay. So, let me just go back to this. So going back to this slide right here, okay, so we've got the tribulation, and the tribulation is either a rapture at the beginning, or a rapture in the middle, or one second coming at the end, or a rapture at the beginning and a second coming at the end, or a rapture in the middle and a second coming at the end. Everybody follow that? So that's the scope of the tribulation period. All right? And again, all those views have ways of making the interpretation a little bit cleaner. Okay? They all have scriptural support, in my opinion. They're just, a couple of them are wrong. All right, so millennial views. The 1,000 years in Revelation chapter 20 is the only place in the text of Scripture where there is demarcated a period of time. So the term millennium would have been foreign to the Old Testament prophets, okay? Because the Old Testament prophets had no idea about 1,000 years. But God promised that He would return Israel to the land and He would bless them. And when God says He's going to do something, He does it. So what we know, if we, again, take a futurist perspective, if we take a literal perspective, what we know is the millennium will last for 1,000 years. Okay? So let me take you through this slide again. All right, so in my view, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the trumpet of the Lord will sound, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we which are alive and remain will be caught up to be with the Lord in the air. So shall we be with the Lord. Then there will be this 7-year period called the tribulation. First 3.5 years, a time of peace. Last 3.5 years, all hell breaks loose on earth. Then we have at the end of that 7-year tribulation, we have the second coming of Christ, in which He comes, we come with Him. I know, Butch, you'll be carrying an AR-15, but we're coming to defeat the forces of Satan. You know, Revelation tells us that Jesus comes with a sword protruding from His mouth, so it's not going to be fun. Okay? But we have the second coming, or some people will refer to it as the second advent. And there's a space of time in there that's about 75 days. Most conservative scholars believe that is when the judgment, called the judgment of the sheep and goats, is going to take place. Which means those who survive the tribulation, okay, and in that process, those who become believers will enter into the millennium in their natural bodies. Those who survive but reject the gospel will be cast into what Matthew calls utter darkness. Okay? And that's called the judgment of the nations, or the sheep and goat judgment. Okay? Then you have the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and we will reign with Him. Okay? And we will be in our glorified bodies, and I won't be bad anymore. But there will be some folks who enter that the suggestion is that they will live long lives, okay, but they will do so in their natural bodies. In the end, Satan has been bound for the 1,000 years. In the end, Satan is loose. There's a great gathering of people who don't know the Lord on earth that have come through the millennium. And there'll be what Ezekiel calls the battle of Gog and Magog. Okay? And as a result of that battle, God will once again defeat the forces of evil. Okay? And so that takes us into that second slot up there, you see, the millennium. Okay? So the millennium is really about God's promise to Israel. Okay? We are participants in that because in Ephesians, Paul said there was a great mystery. What was that mystery? Jews and Gentiles together in the church. So we get to be partakers of the promise that God made to Israel because of the church. Okay? But it's really God's fulfillment to Israel. All right, so you have the millennial period, you have the battle of Gog and Magog. At the end, and the devil is defeated, he's cast into the lake of fire, And then we have something called the Great White Throne Judgment. The Great White Throne Judgment is it. It is the final judgment. And those that don't know the Lord, who didn't know the Lord, are resurrected, and they are cast into the lake of fire and will be tormented forever. I preached a message on hell here a while back, but that's what hell is. The lake of fire. Okay? So, and again, the Great White Throne Judgment ushers in the new heaven and the new earth, the third block. Okay? The new heaven and the new earth is where all the walleyes bite every Sunday. Okay? Just kidding. But the new heaven and the new earth is a place that is clearly defined by what God intended in the beginning. In other words, better than the Garden of Eden. And we will enter into that, and that will be a time of eternal rest. So the message of Revelation, remember, I said was about suffering in the church. When we get to the millennium, still going to be suffering. When we get to the new heaven and the earth, new earth, no more suffering, no more pain, no more crying. It's over. And God wins. And He establishes our new heaven and new earth. So let me see if there's anything else I want to tell you here. So I just described to you what premillennialism is. I've already described, I should do it this way. I'm looking at stuff and you're not seeing it. All right. So premillennialism, that's what I just got done talking about. Life in the millennium, I just got done talking about. Final judgment, I just got done talking about. The rapture and the second coming, I've talked about that. The judgment seat of Christ. Okay. There are two things that will happen after the rapture. Okay? One of them is what's called the judgment seat of Christ, the Bema seat. And it is a time, if you can, this is the way Paul conceptualizes it. John, you were a track coach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And people run races, and then what happens? You get a medal, right? Or get some kind of reward. The Greeks put a crown on their head. Okay? So Paul's idea of the Bema Seat judgment is to stand before the Bema and be rewarded for the life we've lived. Now, there are a couple points that I would make about judgment seat of Christ. It is going to occur, in my view, while we are in heaven, after the rapture. And it basically is an exhaustive evaluation of our lives. It is also a time of reward and not punishment. We will be recompensed for the deeds we have done, whether good or bad, 2 Corinthians 5:10. The term used refers to a summing up or an estimation of the total pattern of a believer's life. So all those out there, all you out here that are obsessive compulsive, because of the grammar and syntax here, the overall focus should keep us from worrying over every stupid thing we've ever done or thoughtless sin we've ever committed. This is not a time for God to whack us. Okay? This is a time for God to bless us, to reward us. For, yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I saw that. I'm talking like God would, you know. Yeah, I saw that, right? Yeah, I saw that. Okay? And that was really good. That's the kind of judgment that's going to be. That's the kind of language that Paul uses. All right, so that's going to occur in heaven. There are 5 heavenly crowns associated with that. Again, going back to the Greek games. Okay? And basically, the crowns are rewards promised to those who've been faithful. And we can look at them individually here for 1 second. The imperishable crown, those that run in such a race that they've obtained the goal, they won. They stayed in the race. The imperishable crown is about staying in the race. We didn't quit. The crown of rejoicing is about being a lover of Christ to the extent that we tell others about him and we bring him with us to heaven. That's the crown of rejoicing. The crown of righteousness, that's for everybody who loved his appearing. We were grateful that Jesus came. Crown of glory, the crown we awarded to all those who long for or love his appearing. Crown of life, so the crown of glory and the crown of righteousness are very similar. The crown of life, again, it's about being faithful even to the point of death. And there'll be a lot of martyrs who will get that crown of life, who paid the ultimate price. All right, so then the other thing is what we as Christians do really well, and that is eat. Okay, yeah, this slide is just about evidence that the Bema Seat is going to occur during the tribulation. But the second event is the marriage supper of the Lamb, and this is actually found in Revelation 19. And as Stephen was saying earlier, what is the church? The church is the bride of Christ, okay? And the consummation of that relationship will occur at what's called the marriage supper of the Lamb. And what a heck of a time that will be. What a time of rejoicing that will be when we will be united with Christ. All right. So there's a couple other views here of the millennium, and I know we're past time. Postmillennialism was very popular during the first half of the 20th century. And postmillennialism, in its essence, believed that the church could bring in the millennial kingdom by converting the majority of people who lived on earth. Okay? And so the idea was we need to get as many Christian converts as possible, because at the point in which that happens, we will reach the millennial blessing. And again, that is assuming that the millennium has nothing to do with Israel. Okay? I'm trying to remember the guy that made that popular during World War II, but it slips me right now. Probably the most common approach to understanding the millennium is something called amillennialism, which basically means no millennium. Okay? And people that often believe in no millennium also only believe in one judgment, which would be a judgment at the end of the world. And usually people that are amillennialists also don't embrace the idea of the wedding supper of the Lamb or the judgment seat of Christ, either one. Okay? For them, we live our Christian life, we die and go to heaven, and maybe someday we get resurrected, maybe not. Okay? And you'll find that among a lot of liberals. So, what I want to leave you with this tonight. And behold, I am coming soon. Amen? And that's not a fire escape. That's not because we can't take it. That's because we love his appearing. Sweet Jesus, right? Leaning on the everlasting arms. Okay, well, this winter has been, fall and spring has been great. Thank you for all your attention and time you put in to coming to class. Appreciate every one of you. And I have one question. Yeah.
Okay. they talk about the 144,000.
Yeah.
The tribe of Israel.
Yeah,
Now, I've heard people say that basically there's a totally different end times for the Jews and for the Christians.
yeah. So, the 144,000 reflect the day of the Lord, okay? And the tribulation part of the day of the Lord. Because what the Old Testament teaches us is that God, even when Israel was as wicked as the devil, God always had a people for his name. The 144,000 represents the fact that God does not abandon his people. And that those that are faithful, he will be faithful to. And so they come, and their job is to preach Jesus Christ to their Jewish brethren. And there are 144,000. If you look at the 12 tribes of Israel, you know, you do the math, you know, that's where that comes from. Yeah. All right. Well, Lord bless you all. And you're welcome. And if Jesus